7 weeks into my freshman year, I received a call from the Colorado Springs Police Department that stated my brother had been murdered. My brother's murder 42 years ago remains one of the most gruesome single murders in the state of Colorado. They found Michael in the Rockies. I've been to the very place deep in the Rockies, 100 yards up a hill. For a little over 25 years, I allowed anger and hatred to intermittently consume me. And that anger and hatred was a lever that the devil pulled on a regular basis that resulted in self-destructive behaviors.
My name is Ryan Ayala, and welcome to another episode of Real Catholic Man. What is the nature of suffering, and how does it impact our lives on a personal and societal level? Can suffering be a catalyst for personal growth and transformation? Or is it simply an unfortunate aspect of the human experience? What insights does the Catholic Church offer humanity through difficult times? In the face of immense suffering in the world, what role does empathy play in fostering compassion and taking action to alleviate the pain of others? Well, today I'm very excited for our show today because we have Mr. Tim Jeffries who will be joining us to discuss the problem of suffering at large. So please help me in introducing and welcoming Mr. Jeffries. So thank you for joining the show today.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Ryan, and thank you so much for your holy call to this special new media vocation.
So Mr. Jeffries is the first guest I've ever had who's smoking a cigar. So you're going to automatically, you already have street cred with most of my audience. So what kind of cigar are you smoking? I just need to know.
I'm smoking one of my favorites. It's Abu Evasion Nicaragua Synchro. And
wow.
Let's just call it one of my whimsical vices.
So I don't know if you know this, Tim, but my family, I'm Nicaraguan, 100% Nicaraguan. My mom and dad are from Nicaragua. So I only smoke Nicaraguan cigars. You've really won your way to my heart already. So.
Awesome.
Driving this interview here. So
great.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your story?
Well, I tell my daughters all the time that you just never know someone's story. And giving all the immense blessings of my life, which in many ways are out in public for those to see, to take heart in, to critique. You know, I'm a statistical miracle multiple times over. Because based on what I came from, chaos and violence, when my mother finally mustered the courage to divorce my spectacularly failed father, we went from having some money to having no money. So there was poverty during my teen years. I've been blessed to be the patriarch of my family since I was 14 years old. And there are numerous instances where God has compelled me to do things well beyond what I felt I was capable of. I was the first in my direct line ever to go to college and to pursue a master's. And my direct line is impressive. On my mother's side, my vavô and vavô immigrated in the early 1900s from Portugal. They did not have a penny in their pocket or an English word in their vocabulary. And as it pertains to my dad's side, God rest his soul, we are a pioneer family of America. On his mother's side, we have a descendant that came to America on the Mayflower. And on his father's side, we were one of the earlier families of Virginia. And speaking to that, my great-grandfather was a Pony Express rider on my dad's side.
Wow.
So I got my bachelor's at Santa Clara University. I have two masters, one at Duke University in business and one at the Augustine Institute in Catholic leadership. I grew up in the high-tech space because since there were no white collars in my family, I didn't know what else to do. So I went into high tech, and a blessing of coming from poverty is it doesn't take a lot of money to think you have money. So I felt rich, like ever since I got a customer service job making 21 grand a year. So I've been blessed with successes as well as failures. And at least in modern day times, my wife and I own a metal finishing company. I call it the Little Company of Miracles. My greatest love is all things Roman Catholic. So I have a lot of charitable pursuits. I have a nonprofit that's very important to me that attacks the 7 deadly sins on social media. And I could go on and on and on. Perhaps the most important thing, again, speaking the statistical miracles in my life, I'm married to my college sweetheart. We've been married 36 years.
Congratulations.
We have 2 moral, high-achieving daughters. And as a result, we have 2 beautiful grandkids. And
wonderful.
And despite all the suffering of my life, I'm blessed beyond measure.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's something I kind of want to get right into here, because we all will go through suffering. That seems to be like a guarantee. But your life in particular, it seems suffering is kind of woven throughout your life in a very prominent way, and just always just kind of been attached to you. And so one of the things, I read one of your essays on suffering, and I want to know a little bit more about kind of your upbringing. But one of the things you say in your essay is, you said suffering is central to knowing and loving God. I kind of want to talk a little bit of what do you mean by that?
Years upon years, I've shared with people that I have a PhD in suffering from Bootstrap University last century. I chafed against suffering quite a bit, up to including battling hatred for various reasons that we may explore. But God is so faithful. He is so patient. He is so merciful that despite our respective journeys as prodigal sons and daughters, he always, always lovingly waits with open arms to embrace us when we return to him, out of a sheer gratuitous act of love. When our triune God took on a human nature, ultimately to save us. People don't stop to consider his vocation was purely to suffer. Now, when I say such a thing, people immediately go to the crucifixion, and rightfully so. Jesus suffered every day in his human nature, because in his divine nature, he knew. I do believe one of the days Jesus Christ suffered the most in his human nature was during the Sermon on the Mount. Think about it. Yeah. A beautiful day overlooking the Sea of Galilee. Thousands were gathered out of love, seeking God and looking to glorify God. And Jesus rewarded us. The Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes, the call to love. We could go on, but yet he knew what was to come. He saw Peter in the crowd and knew he'd be denied 3 times. He saw Judas, who he greeted with a kiss on the cheek at the Last Supper. So I think Jesus suffered immensely that day because he knew. One of the turning points for me was to understand that Jesus not only suffered for all of us, he allowed himself to suffer for me. And so perhaps the net of your question is, one of the profound and mysterious blessings of suffering provides us an opportunity to be cruciformed to Jesus Christ. And just to extend, I will offer that when one considers the greatest suffering of their life, broken marriages, divorced parents, chaos, violence, murder, suicide, maybe drug addictions, whatever it may be. Because everyone's greatest suffering, that's their greatest suffering. Everyone's greatest suffering is when they were in the Garden of Gethsemane, whether they admitted it or not, and they were calling out for this cup to pass. And God, through his love and his mystery, provides us an opportunity to cruciform to him, to become one with him. The mistake that we make, given our weakened, sinful existence, is we not only try or even surrender to suffering without Jesus being involved, even though he's right there, but we often fail to consider that in God's loving mystery, he's allowing our suffering to sanctify ourselves and to throw ourselves into his arms.
Man, there's so much to unpack there. And one of the things I want to specifically ask you about, how have you experienced this in your own life? You've been very close, and again, seems like suffering has just sort of been attached to you in a very strong way. So tell us a little bit more about that.
I grew up in Sacramento, when Sacramento was a very different place, a beautiful place. Despite all the blessings of Sacramento, there was great suffering there. As I briefly alluded, the chaos, the violence, the poverty. And my first weeks at Santa Clara University, close to heaven as I believe I'd ever come.
Wow. And you're still like a proud alum of St. Clara, right? Do you still have connections there?
At Santa Clara?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Because that's what I thought. You're still proud alum.
7 weeks into my freshman year, my mom was out shopping. My little brother was out playing. And I received a call from a heroic detective of the Colorado Springs Police Department that stated my brother had been murdered. I felt like Sacramento was always with me, almost chasing me. My brother's murder 42 years ago remains one of the most gruesome single murders in the state of Colorado. 42 years later, they found Michael in the Rockies. I've been to the very place deep in the Rockies, 100 yards up a hill, even though I was filled with anger and rage and sadness. I knew it was a miracle they found Michael. For a little over 25 years, I allowed anger and hatred to intermittently consume me. And believe me, I already had a lot of anger and hatred from the home where I grew up. Not for my mother, she was a hero, but for my father. And that anger and hatred was a lever that the devil pulled gleefully on a regular basis that resulted in self-destructive behaviors. It was only until I started to make this mysterious and miraculous pivot to embrace all my suffering. That's when my life got easier, because I was becoming holy.
But what was that pivot? What was that moment? I know it wasn't a radical shift, but what was a change of thinking where you had to say, I have to let this anger go. I have to forgive this man who did this to my brother. Like, what was that? Did you go to a retreat? Did you have a night at prayer? You had a powerful rosary experience? Did you call out to the Lord?
December 2001 was the first parole hearing for the surviving murderer of my big brother. And if you heard even the first minute of my testimony, it was filled with anger and hatred. My wife and I went to Paris. We went to Notre Dame, and it was a performance of the Gregorian chant choir. And all of a sudden, God placed my brother's perpetrators in my prayers. And it was stunning to me, shocking. I asked God just to help me keep them in my prayers, but it was a full 7 years before I prayed for them. In the prior year, I was back at Notre Dame with my youngest daughter, Palm Sunday Mass. And what came to me that I wrestled with for a year forgive us our sins as we forgive the trespasses of others. I was starting to come to understand that, boy, I really needed mercy because I wanted to rid myself of this anger and hatred. After wrestling for a year, God graced me with the illumination that was always there, that I begged God not just to forgive me, but to forgive them. Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Wow.
On the anniversary of Michael's murder, having dinner with a beautiful Jesuit priest, a Jesuit that St. Ignatius would recognize.
Love it.
And I was weeping based on the notion that Michael was alone. Of course, the two murderers are there, but he was alone. This beautiful, transformational Jesuit priest, who I love like a brother, reaches over the table, touches my arm. He said, "Tim, can I step on this sacred ground?" And I said, "Of course, Father." He said, "Jesus never left Michael. Michael wasn't alone. Jesus was right there." What he said is that when Michael was screaming and crying, blood splattered about, Jesus wept too. But yet when Michael took his final breath, Jesus smiled because there was no more blood. And Michael smiled because there was no more suffering. So was there one moment for me? No. The blessing of suffering, of the many blessings, is it drives you to the ground.
Yeah.
If you're being reasonable to yourself, you do nothing but cry out to God.
I remember one time hearing this quote from Mother Teresa where she said, "It takes love to forgive and humility to forget." So the world says forgive, don't forget. But Mother Teresa says forgive and forget. It's so easy to think about anger just remaining at the will, or forgiveness is like an emotional response. Aquinas talks about how forgiveness is really an imposition on it's an act of your will. When I forgive someone, I'm choosing to forgive. Even if my emotions are still very much angry and frustration, and you're frustrated, forgiveness does belong to the will. So tell me about those moments when you're sitting in prayer. These men are coming into your mind, are coming into your memory, they're coming into your prayer, and the Lord gives you a grace to act in your will to forgive these men. Forgiveness is not just a one-time event. Forgiveness is a daily thing that we have to choose every single day.
I was on the phone with this great Jesuit priest, and I said, "Father, I fully understand that if the surviving murderer has experienced the true broken heart of contrition, I fully understand that God has forgiven this murderer, that he's embraced him with love." I said, "But Father, what if the murderer's statements are all a ruse? What if he's just taken a page out of the convict playbook, up for parole, saying, 'You found Jesus, I beg for forgiveness'?" What if it's a ruse? I said, "Am I called to forgive my brother's surviving murderer before Jesus Christ has?" And he said, "To forgive is divine." So how do you forgive with the greatest assaults and hurts and pains in your life? You have to get out of God's way, and you have to access the inner divinity, right? Body's called a temple because the Holy Spirit resides in us. And you have to be an instrument of God's peace. That is the only possible way. Now, more simplistically, which I share with many, because I talk about suffering quite openly, can you get beyond this by yourself? Often they'll say no. I said, correct. Give it completely to God. Dear Lord, this is way above my capability and pay grade. Please, oh please, take this cup from me. After my miraculous prayers of forgiveness for the perpetrators, God has called me on a regular basis, sometime once a year, to pen a Christian note of encouragement to my brother's murderer. Can't do it by myself. even now, where forgiveness has been embedded for over a decade, I will sign the cross and I will beg God to use me as his instrument of peace.
Wow.
One must unite it with Jesus Christ, knowing full well he's the only one who can carry that cross.
Right. I remember one of my favorite poets, he's a French poet, but he has a line where he says, to suffer alone is to insult your friend. So in other words, like your best friend being your wife, how has your wife helped you with this suffering? I mean, you did it in partnership with the Lord, but you also were given a lifelong partner, a wife, a spouse, to carry the cross with you. So how did she help you kind of unpack and hold and all the suffering in your life?
The reason America is still great is we produce a lot of Marys. The reason America is deathly sick is we don't produce enough Josephs. Who was at the foot of the cross? Mary and the women of Jerusalem. Now, people go, well, St. John was there. Yes. And whimsically, not irreverently, I've often joked, well, he's young and he was probably looking around going, where'd all my brothers go? Where are they? I don't see him. I'm staying right here. He's the only apostle who passed from old age. Every other apostle was martyred, and temporarily, horribly so. I've always been a direct to Jesus guy, but the beauty of the Order of Malta, of which my wife and I are members, is it has brought me to Mary, which I'm sure pleases my great-grandmother, my vovó from Portugal, because she always had a rosary in her hand. And we serve the sick and dying in Lourdes every year. I've done it 13 years in a row. It makes all the sense in the world that the first yes to Jesus Christ, the true and immaculate Eve, is Mary. If anyone's going to dial up a special prayer or two in heaven to take to Jesus Christ, of course it's Mary. But when we think of our life, well, at least for me, it has been Marian figures. My wife, my mother, her mother, my great-grandmother that have formed me. My wife, in Disney speak, it's the lady and the tramp, the beauty and the beast. I'll extend that my mother gave me my heart. My great-grandmother gave me my faith. Now, my grandmother, who founded a plumbing company, gave me my brass knuckles. One of the most extraordinary blessings to my wife and my mother was to vanquish all the hatred and anger of my life. And with my wife, she deserved it. Yeah. Absolutely deserved it. For my mother, she needed to see it and still needs to see it.
Yeah.
I finally gifted her with the devotion and the love of a good son, of a good man. How did she help me? Well, many ways she allowed me to suffer without judgment. True grace.
True grace, absolutely.
True grace. Thanks be to God.
She actually popped up in the screen a little bit as you were talking about her. As she realized she was on the screen, she got out.
What a perfect metaphor. She's
it was awesome. Tell us a little bit about, was there a prayer, a specific prayer that you consistently turned to, or a particular saint whom you sought as an intercessor during this time?
St. Paul has always resonated with me. In fact, in Romans 3-5, which I'll neither confirm nor deny, is referenced in a tattoo I have. It says we must rejoice in our sufferings.
Yeah.
Because from suffering comes perseverance. Perseverance comes character. From character comes hope. And hope does not disappoint because Jesus Christ, by way of the Holy Spirit, has been poured out for us. So St. Paul has always been my guide. It took a priest in Malta to highlight one of the reasons he is my guy. when I introduced myself as Timothy, he said, "Oh, you're a friend of Paul." It's like, yes.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome. Yeah.
Right? The prayer is the Lord's Prayer. In the Sermon on the Mount, when I believe he was suffering dearly in his human nature, Jesus Christ said, "Do not babble in prayer. Say this." And there's a great saint, he said something to the effect, to say the Lord's Prayer deeply, reverently, perfectly is more powerful than 1,000 prayers.
Yeah.
See, the devil wants us to think it's difficult. The devil loves the gray of the world, loves it. But in the temporal construct where gray does exist, if you want life to be easier, you must focus on the eternal construct, the true denominator. And that's where you have the holy black and white. So when people are suffering, and I'm blessed to help them, I'll say, if you're honoring the commandments, a moral life, if you're treasuring the Beatitudes, a virtuous life, if you live God's supreme commandment to love God and to love others, and by the way, not exclusively, to love others for God, with God, in God, you live a loving life. And if you say the Lord's Prayer, a prayerful life. So if all you do, honor the 10, treasure the 8, live the 1, and say the 1, doesn't matter what your temporal circumstances are. If you're doing just those things, you are on a path to heaven. Doesn't mean an easy path. It's never easy, because the more good we do in the world, the more we are subjected to the devil's attacks. I mean, the devil hates that we're talking right now.
This is why I really love being Catholic, because we're the only religion in the world that says don't run from your cross, but embrace your cross. And that the only way to the Lord, to the glory of heaven, is through the cross. There's no other way. I love that. I love our faith teaches us to embrace the cross. Just because we embrace the cross, we embrace the suffering, we lean in our suffering, meaning we embrace it, we come face to face with it, we deal with all of the ugliness that it can present. It doesn't necessarily mean that we may understand the suffering either, because there's this culture where we're trying to understand the suffering. And I understand that's part of human nature. We're always seeking to know. We're always wanting to know the next thing. But with suffering in particular, we may not ever come to understand why we have gone through this particular suffering. And in doing so, we are forced to sometimes just let it go or surrender it all to the Lord and say, Lord, by your great mystery, I'm giving this to you. I don't know why you've allowed me to encounter this. I don't know why you permitted this evil to take hold in my life, but I give it all to you. I surrender it all to you.
One of the many beautiful saints of Holy Mother Church is Saint Rose of Lima. The only ladder by which we may get to heaven is the cross.
Yeah.
I know and embrace these things more than ever, but that doesn't mean I'm laughing and giggling every day. I've had 20 surgeries. I have a ton of titanium. I battle chronic pain. Heck, I just had hand surgery yesterday, and temporarily that sucked. It's not like I'm laughing and giggling every day, but every day is a blessing. You know why they call today the present? Because it's a gift. It's a gift from God. Now, one of the miracles that I've been able to pull from my brother Michael's just horrific murder, which, I mean, I have these horrible pictures right in front of me of his body when they found him a couple decades ago. Even when I was still wrestling with hate, through God's grace, through my brother's intercession, I came to understand that on November 3rd, 1981, my brother defined what a bad day is in our family. And so for over a quarter of a century, I've never said I've had a bad day. It's impossible for me to say that. Yeah. I mean, I could be stabbed 20 times today, and it's still 45 times less than my big brother. Yeah. But again, it's not like I'm laughing and giggling, always loving God enough to accept his mystery, not to dwell on trying to figure it out.
Tim, I love this. Live the 10, or no, honor the 10, live the 8th, say the 1. I love that. Thank you so much for your time. I do, if there's a man listening right now who's maybe going through a specific suffering or particular suffering, what's a quick spiritual advice you would offer him right now? Maybe he's going through a serious cross, something that he can do today to get to kind of help him console his heart. What would you offer to this brother of ours?
Life is akin to the passion of Christ. So if we start with the Garden of Gethsemane, the abuse he suffered, body, mind, and his human nature, the physical ravaging he suffered, the falling of the cross, the nails on the cross. To all those who are suffering, they need to understand that Jesus allowed such things for all of us. Jesus allowed such things specifically for them as encouragement. So much so, Jesus was on the cross. He said, Eloi, Eloi, my sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? He did that for us because temporarily we feel that way all the time, but eternally it's never true. I mean, God is love. And people say it, but they don't stop to think about what it means. He created time and space out of love. He holds time and space together out of love. He stands there as the eternal father of the prodigal son and daughters out of love. He's not the punishing God of the Old Testament.
He's not a tyrant. He's a father.
People, when they suffer something horrible, why did God do this to me? He didn't. God allowed it. And now you have the opportunity, albeit mysterious, to let God help you use it. It's how the greatest darkness, the greatest saints emerge. And the saints of Holy Mother Church, most if not all, have suffered horribly. Each of us is created in the image and likeness of God.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really found this show really edifying. And to all my brothers who are listening to this episode, I hope you found encouragement. And I hope you take to heart what Mr. Jeffries had to say. So thank you so much for joining us. If you like the podcast or got something out of this episode, please share it with your friends and family. Subscribe, like, comment, rate, and review if you haven't. Finally, as a gesture of our appreciation, we would like to offer you an exclusive discount code for listening to our podcast. Please visit www.discountcatholicstore.com or thecatholicstore.com and type podcast at checkout, where you'll receive 20% off your entire cart. Thank you for listening, and God bless.
God bless you.